Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Still with me, my guest, Thierry, Director for IT and Business-to-Business Solutions at Samsung Africa. And in our Zambian bureau, we have Habeenzu Mulunda, Public Relations Manager for the Lusaka City Council. And we're now joined by Daniel Rees, Senior Manager for Global Infrastructure at KPMG. Gentlemen, once again, thank you for joining us. When we left just before the break, we said that we are going to pick up on public-private partnerships. Now, Thierry, this is one aspect of the Samsung business that has really gotten off to a good start in Zambia. Let's talk a little bit about how the government's adoption of e-solutions to some of their targets has really enabled a good partnership.
I think we've both identified that there's an issue from an urbanization perspective, and we've heard very clearly that there's pressure on the Lusaka City Council as well. So how do we actually help in terms of curbing that urbanization? In other words, to provide services in a rural environment. And this is where we've actually partnered with the government in terms of providing those e-solutions, specifically focused, as I mentioned, on education and on health. One of the elements that we're looking at is to see how we can make use of the doctors more efficiently and providing those solutions in rural areas. And the second one, obviously, is to make sure that we have education solutions which are just as good as the solutions that you would find in urban areas, but in those rural areas as well.
Of course, Daniel, if we come to you, it seems as if infrastructure has been pinpointed as a game changer for the city of Lusaka to deliver on its mandate as an engine of growth. From where you sit, are you seeing infrastructure development reflected as a priority on the government's agenda?
Yes, it's fair to say that the wonderful opportunity that faced Lusaka has also had challenges to date around some of the basic infrastructure. If you think of water, power and transport, these have been lacking with load shedding, inadequate water and congested roads. However, the government has put a real priority. I think the fellow panelists earlier mentioned 400 kilometers of roads in Lusaka that are being rehabilitated, but also improving walkways and the connections with intermodal transport connections, which are essential. The national utility ZESCO are reinforcing some of the transmission lines and substations around Lusaka so that when new generation comes online, and today's a very exciting day, our president is at Kariba commissioning a new generator at Kariba North Bank. So when that extra power comes online, it can be distributed within Lusaka, and the water systems are being tackled. And I'm very pleased to hear the other panelists just mention the steps forwards in ICT, because of course it's access to services rather than just transport that's essential. And we can reduce some of the movements by delivering solutions through the internet.
I would think that Thierry here at the desk would agree strongly that there's a very prominent role for the private sector to see the delivery of these infrastructure projects. And perhaps staying there with you, Daniel, what are we seeing coming out of Lusaka from an incentivizing the private sector point of view? Are we seeing the government really putting out attractive offers to private sector so that they can have bankable projects that they're working on?
It certainly is. The Zambia Development Agency was established well over 10 years ago and has a very clear framework for attracting investors. Once you get a license, and if you invest over $500,000, there's a wide range of non-fiscal incentives that relate to protection, ability to own land, but then also monetary. So for the first 5 years, there's no tax on profits, and thereafter there's a staged increase up to 10 years. There's no tax on dividends, and quite a number of other incentives. And this really has helped boost manufacturing and other industries. There's a long way to go. But interestingly, I think we're going to see the landscape change a bit more again, which is the renewed emphasis on multi-facility economic zones. And that's looking at the model of other emerging countries where these have been very successful. And we've got two that are just getting established outside Lusaka, and these have additional incentives that broaden the net on types of industry that are applicable to get these incentives. And I think that's going to drive a lot more growth, both around the country, but specifically here in Lusaka.
And perhaps, Habeenzu, you can pick up on this point that Daniel has raised around multi-facility economic zones. In particular, which sectors are being targeted by these zones, and what are the outcomes that we're looking for?
Definitely, I think, all the sectors, they play a bigger role when it comes to the multi-facility economic zone, because it's not just one entity which is being looked at. We want to have an all-inclusive approach, because we get, the participation of all the stakeholders, and they have also a share in ensuring that a country develop. And this is the vision which the government is trying to float out there. Suffice to say that we want also, as a city of Lusaka, to have, that picture of, other status, cities around the world. And when you look at the vision which we've been carrying, especially that, we clocked, 100 years, the vision for the government was that we need to start looking forward.
Perhaps, Thierry, let's turn to you. I mean, what seems to be a key theme here as well is how benefits in one particular sector can have spillover, provided that those sectors are connected. Yeah. Now, this is also one potential that ICT can deliver on. Yeah. In light of that, in looking at the case of Lusaka, how are we seeing other sectors developing from the ICT advancements that they've made?
I think any company that's going to make an investment in any particular country needs to understand the policies of the government. And we've had experience from the government's perspective in terms of full cooperation from a private and a public perspective. One of the examples is we've had situations where we've found a lot of counterfeit products in Zambia, and the government has really taken this very seriously and assisted us in stamping this out. So that's one of the elements of the full cooperation from the government's perspective, because that for us is an important aspect. I think in terms of the e-government solutions, that is an MOU that we are busy working with the government directly. We've done all the presentations, and we're now looking at specific environments, obviously with a big focus on education and health.
Of course, one would be slightly worried if they looked at the composition of the labor force in Lusaka, where more than half, almost 60%, is in the informal sector. How can ICT play a role in creating entrepreneurs such that we can see the number of people that are actually able to have a sustainable livelihood increase? Well,
this is exactly why we said that the focus needs to be as well to curb the urbanization. In other words, to provide those services in rural areas and to provide quality services in rural areas, so that you're actually in creating that workforce. But over and above that, it's also to participate with the government in specific sectors, in specific programs that we've engaged with. But imagine a generation going through a smart school environment, just one generation. In 10 years' time, your workforce has changed dramatically. And this is exactly what we're pushing for as well.
And in light of that, would you say that the ICT competency actually has the effect of leveling the playing field when one looks at creating a globally competitive workforce?
Absolutely, but also from an urban to a rural environment that has the necessary impact as well.
Right. Let's perhaps stay with you a little bit longer, Thierry. I mean, when we look at the future African cities, and we often hear about how these cities need to be shining beacons on the continent's economic growth story. Do you believe that when we look at the cities in relation to slums, that we're moving in the right direction?
I think we are, but I think there's a lot more than just the basic technologies that are available in civilized environments, or let me call it in developed cities, such as cities that you'd find in North America or South Korea, or even in Western Europe for that matter. It's not to say that those solutions are ideal for African environments. One has to adapt the solution specifically for that. So that's where we're focusing on. And again, it's under the umbrella of Built for Africa. So we're looking at specific solutions which are designed and are adapted for African environments. And a solution can be a simple thing like just a refrigerator that has, if there's a power failure, as an example, that it actually keeps the food in a frozen state for a much longer period without power. Those are the kind of solutions which are ideal for African environments.
But perhaps let me object and say that you know, one would think that the natural development path that African markets should follow should be migrating towards products and services that are reflective or similar to what we see in the developed world. And what I'm hearing from you is that Built for Africa is maybe quite different. It's about you know, maybe being competitive within the environment.
Absolutely.
Shouldn't we be trying to shift the structural challenges and constraints that we have so that we're on a level playing field globally?
So that is a process that has to happen.
Yeah.
But to actually participate in that process, you can't go from the one state to the other. Another practical, and we look at it from a grassroots level perspective. A practical example is, again, if I'm in a rural area and I have no access to electricity or very unreliable access to electricity, my solutions need to cater for that.
Yeah.
You know, taking a notebook and putting it on with a solar panel, at least I'm providing a viable environment. And those are the kinds of things that we look at. So it is a process, it is a journey that has to happen.
Yeah.
But I think as well, there's a huge benefit in terms of what we're doing, because in many cases you have a consumer that's buying for the first time. That consumer's buying for the first time. We need to make sure that that consumer has a good experience. And whether that consumer is in Africa or in North America, the products need to be adapted for that. Simple things like that.
Right. Habeenzu, let me come back to you in Lusaka and perhaps touch on maybe a final point on a very important function that a city has to perform, and that's obviously creating a conducive environment for employment creation. Again, if we look at the stats, a large portion of the labor force is in the informal sector. How are you working to turn this around?
Yes, we do have a larger portion which is in the informal sector, and I think this is what the government has been trying to address. The current government, when it came into power, they've been trying to bring that aspect on board to try and turn around this issue. Essentially, it is a little bit challenging in the sense that perhaps we may not have all these group of people swallowed in the formal sector. But what the government is trying to do is to also create an environment where the people that may not be swallowed into the informal sector have also a privilege of doing businesses within their own domain. And as such, from Lusaka City Council's point of view, we've been trying to work with the Ministry of Local Government and Housing, for instance, in the Central Business District, to try and come up with street marketing, for instance. We have done the drawings which the government did request us as the Lusaka City Council through the Department of Engineering, so that we can see how we can bring in these people who may not have a privilege of getting into the formal sector. So really, it is a long way to go, and we are trying to see how best, together with other players, we can have this matter handled.
We've come to the end of this week's edition of Invest Africa. Thanks to all my guests: Thierry Boulanger, Director for IT and Business to Business Solutions at Samsung Africa; Habeenzu Mulunda, Public Relations Manager for the Lusaka City Council; and Daniel Ree, Senior Manager for Global Infrastructure at KPMG.